You think it's just nerves. Makes sense. There's money on the line. Your heart starts beating faster. Your palms get sweaty. There's tension building inside. It all seems pretty obvious. Anyone would feel nervous. But then there's one question. Why doesn't that feeling go away after the bet? Why does it sometimes get even worse? Why can someone stop enjoying the game, stop believing they're about to win, start feeling drained by the whole thing, and still keep going? If it were just nerves, it would work like ordinary stress, like before an exam, like before an important phone call, like stepping onto a stage. The moment happens and the tension starts to fade. But in gambling, it often works the other way around. You already placed the bet. The outcome already happened. But inside, nothing settles. There's this feeling that something is still unfinished, like you can't stop right now, like you need one more try just to level yourself out. And this is where the important part begins. The problem isn't that the person is just nervous. The problem is that anxiety in gambling very quickly stops being a side effect. It becomes part of the mechanism itself. So the person is no longer sitting there just for the win, not just for the thrill, not even just for the hope. They're already trying to deal with what the game itself has created, their own tension, their own inner discomfort, that feeling that things have gone wrong and need to be fixed immediately. And that's why, from the outside, it looks so strange. The person is clearly exhausted, clearly angry, clearly worried about money, but somehow they still don't leave. Because at that point, they're no longer running toward pleasure. They're running away from what they're feeling inside. And that's a completely different story. Anxiety in gambling doesn't work the way most people imagine. Normally, anxiety is a warning signal. Something is wrong. Step back. Stop. Protect yourself. But in gambling, that whole pattern gets flipped upside down. Anxiety doesn't always push you away. A lot of the time, it pushes you deeper in. Because the brain starts seeing the next bet not as another risk, but as a chance to finally relieve the pressure building inside. That's what makes this such a trap. The person is tense. They feel awful. They can feel themselves losing control. And that becomes the exact reason they keep going, even though continuing is what keeps feeding that state in the first place. It's like being desperately thirsty and reaching for salt water. For a second, it feels like relief might be coming. But then the thirst only gets worse. And that's often what gambling does. The anxiety doesn't just sit beside the experience. It gets built directly into the cycle. You place a bet and the tension rises. You wait and your attention narrows. You lose and suddenly there's this sharp urge to fix something right now. Then you bet again and your brain sells it to you as relief, not as danger, not as a mistake, as a solution. That's why someone can be in a terrible emotional state and still feel like stopping is the worst possible move. Because in that moment, stopping doesn't feel like safety. It feels like defeat, like admitting the loss, like being left alone with the anxiety and having nothing to drown it out. So the next bet starts to feel almost logical, not rational, not safe, but emotionally logical. Because at that point, the mind is no longer looking for strategy. It's looking for relief, even if it only lasts a few seconds, even if it's just the illusion of getting control back, even if it's just one quick hit of hope strong enough to interrupt the discomfort. And that's why anxiety in gambling is so dangerous, not just because it hurts, but because it makes people look for rescue in the very thing that is making them worse. That inner tension doesn't begin when someone has completely lost control. It starts much earlier. Usually, it begins with a very small shift. At first, the game still feels like entertainment. There's interest, there's excitement, there's that feeling that something good could happen any second. And then, the first crack appears. It doesn't have to be a huge loss. Sometimes, a few failed bets in a row are enough. Sometimes it's a near win. Sometimes it's just one thought. I've already put too much in to stop now. And in that moment, something changes inside. You're no longer just watching the game. Now you're emotionally tied to the next result, to what happens next, to whether the money comes back, to whether this next moment finally makes the pressure go away. That's where the tension begins. At the point where the result stops being just a result and starts meaning too much. It's no longer just win or lose. Now it starts to feel like the answer to a different question. Will I get control back? Can I fix this? Can I prove to myself that not everything is gone yet? And the more meaning a person loads into the next bet, the heavier everything starts to feel. Because now every second of waiting is charged. This is no longer a casual game running in the background. It becomes a narrow tunnel of attention where there's only money, outcome, and that tense hope that everything is about to turn around. The body joins in fast too. Your pulse speeds up, your breathing changes, your thoughts start looping, and it becomes harder and harder to think clearly. The worst part is that people often don't notice the exact moment it shifts. They think they're still just playing, but in reality, they're already trying to hold themselves together inside an unstable emotional state. That's why inner tension is so deceptive. It doesn't arrive all at once. It builds in pieces. First, mild unease. Then the feeling that you shouldn't stop here. Then the urge to do it one more time. Then the thought that walking away now would make the loss feel final. And before you know it, the game is no longer continuing because it feels good. It's continuing because stopping feels worse. After a few bets, the brain doesn't just calm down and reset. That's what makes this so dangerous. You would think the system would work in a simple way. You place a bet, you get a result, your body reacts, then everything settles. But that's not what usually happens. Because after a few rounds, the brain is no longer reacting to one isolated moment. It starts living inside a chain. One bet bleeds into the next. One outcome carries over into the one after that. And instead of returning to baseline, your mind stays half activated the whole time. That's why even short pauses can start to feel uncomfortable. Nothing dramatic is happening for a second. No button is being pressed. No wheel is spinning. No card is turning. But inside, the system is still running. Your attention is still locked in. Your body is still waiting. Your mind is still circling around what just happened and what could happen next. And once that state builds up, silence doesn't feel calming anymore. It feels loaded. Because the brain is not only processing what you lost or won, it's anticipating the next chance to change the feeling. That's why people can sit there feeling tense even between bets. Technically, nothing is happening. Psychologically, everything is still happening. The previous loss is still alive in the mind. The near win is still echoing. The hope of the next result is already pulling attention forward. And the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to actually relax. Not because the person is weak, but because the nervous system is no longer treating the game like a simple activity. It's treating it like an unresolved problem. And unresolved problems keep the brain alert. They keep it open. They keep it searching. They keep it hooked on the idea that the next move might finally fix what still feels unfinished. So after a few bets, the person is not just playing anymore. They're carrying emotional momentum. And emotional momentum is hard to shut off. Because now the game isn't just something they're doing. It's something their whole system is bracing around. And once that happens, calm stops feeling natural. Calm starts feeling out of reach. Then money changes too. At first, money can still feel abstract. Just numbers on a screen, just chips, just balance, just something moving up and down inside the game. That's one of the reasons gambling can feel deceptively light in the beginning. The money doesn't always feel fully real. Not in the same way it would feel if you were handing over cash for rent, food, or a bill you can't ignore. Inside the game, it can become strangely distant, almost symbolic. But that distance doesn't last. At some point, the emotional meaning of the money starts to shift. Now it's no longer just money inside the game. Now it starts to feel like security, control, damage, mistake, survival. And that's when the pressure spikes. Because once money stops being background and starts feeling like a threat, every result hits differently. A loss is no longer just disappointing. It becomes personal. It starts to feel like something is slipping, like something important is being damaged in real time, like the situation is no longer annoying, but dangerous. And the worst part is that this doesn't always happen only after a massive loss. Sometimes it happens much earlier. Sometimes all it takes is the sudden realization that the number on the screen is no longer harmless, that it already means something outside the game, that it connects to your actual life, your actual bills, your actual plans, your actual sense of stability. And once that connection becomes emotionally real, the game changes. Now, every next bet carries more weight, because now the person is not only reacting to chance, they're reacting to threat. And when people feel threatened, they don't usually think better. They think faster, narrower, more urgently. That's the moment the game starts pressing on something much deeper than excitement. It starts pressing on fear. Fear of losing more. Fear of not getting it back. Fear of having to face what the loss really means. And that fear creates a brutal contradiction. The person becomes more desperate to protect what's left, but the more desperate they become, the more likely they are to make the kind of decisions that put even more at risk. Because now the game is no longer happening in the space of entertainment. It's happening in the space of perceived danger. And once that shift happens, everything inside tightens. That tightening is exactly what starts to break decision-making. Because anxiety doesn't just make people uncomfortable, it makes them think differently. When anxiety rises, attention narrows. The mind stops seeing the full picture. It zooms in on whatever feels most urgent right now. That can sound useful. In a real emergency, narrowed focus can help. But in gambling, it becomes a trap. Because the mind stops asking the bigger questions. How long have I been doing this? How much have I already lost? What state am I in right now? What happens if I keep going for another hour? Those questions require distance. Anxiety destroys distance. Instead, the brain locks onto the immediate problem. This loss, this moment, this one more chance. That's why people in that state often make choices that seem irrational from the outside, but feel completely justified from the inside. They're not calmly evaluating options. They're trying to escape pressure. And once escape becomes the goal, decision-making changes completely. Now the person is not asking, what is the smart move? They're asking, what might make this feeling stop? That's a very different question, and it leads to very different choices. It leads to chasing, rushing, overcommitting, ignoring limits that would have seemed obvious earlier. Because anxiety creates mental tunnel vision. It pushes everything aside except the possibility of immediate relief. And immediate relief is exactly what the next bet seems to promise. Even if that promise has already failed 10 times in a row. That's how anxiety breaks judgment. Not by making a person lose intelligence, but by making short-term emotional relief feel more important than long-term reality. And once that happens, even bad decisions can start to feel strangely reasonable. Not because they are, but because the mind is no longer operating in a clear, open state. It's operating under pressure, and pressure changes everything. It changes what you notice. It changes what you ignore. It changes what feels urgent. It changes what feels possible. So the person stops making decisions from clarity. They start making decisions from internal discomfort. And that is one of the most dangerous turning points in the entire cycle. Because once anxiety starts choosing for you, the game is no longer just pulling your money. It's pulling your judgment with it. The hidden problem is usually not the money itself. at least not in the way people think. From the outside, it looks obvious. The person lost money, so now they want the money back. And yes, that is part of it. But very often, what they are really trying to recover is something underneath the money. Control. Because a loss in gambling does not just take away value, it creates disruption. It creates this sharp feeling that something has slipped out of your hands, that the situation moved against you, that your own decisions are no longer producing the outcome you need. And for the mind, that can feel unbearable. Not just expensive, unbearable. Because people can tolerate pain better when the pain feels organized, when it makes sense, when it fits a clear cause and effect. But gambling breaks that. You act, but you cannot command the result. You try again, but nothing guarantees correction. You stay engaged, but the entire experience starts feeling unstable. That instability is what gets under the skin. So when the person says, "I need to win it back," what they often mean on a deeper level is something else. I need to feel steady again. I need to feel like I can still affect what happens. I need proof that this is not completely slipping away from me. That is why a simple financial loss can grow into something much bigger emotionally. Because now, the money is carrying symbolic weight. It becomes tied to dignity, competence, self-trust, the ability to recover from a mistake. And once that happens, the next bet no longer feels like just another gamble. It starts to feel like a test. A test of whether you can still turn things around. A test of whether you still have agency. A test of whether this situation owns you or you can still push back. That is the hidden problem. The person is not only reacting to loss, they are reacting to the collapse of control. And when people feel control slipping away, they often become willing to do irrational things just to feel it again. Not because they are foolish, because the mind hates helplessness. Helplessness creates panic. Panic creates urgency. Urgency demands action, and gambling always offers action. Immediate action. One more click. One more spin. One more hand. One more chance to stop feeling powerless. That is why the cycle becomes so seductive. Because every new bet seems to offer more than money. It seems to offer restoration. And that is also why the next bet can feel like relief before it even happens. Not after the result, before the result. The second the person decides to continue, something shifts. For a brief moment, the pressure changes shape. Because indecision is painful. Loss is painful. Uncertainty is painful. But action can feel like movement. And movement feels better than helplessness. That is the trick. The new bet feels like relief. Not because it solves the problem, but because it temporarily interrupts the feeling of being stuck inside the problem. For a few seconds, the mind no longer has to sit there with the loss. It no longer has to fully absorb what happened. It no longer has to face the possibility that the money is gone and nothing can reverse it. Instead, attention gets redirected in the possibility. Maybe this one changes everything. Maybe this is the turn. Maybe this is the moment the pressure breaks. That possibility can feel intoxicating, even when it is irrational, even when the same thought has already failed again and again. Because the brain is not only responding to logic in that moment, it is responding to emotional contrast. Pain, then hope. Pressure, then possibility. Tension, then action. That shift alone can feel like partial relief. It is almost like scratching an itch. Not because the skin is healed, but because the act of scratching briefly overpowers the discomfort. That is what the next bet often does. It does not cure the anxiety. It briefly covers it. It gives the person something to do with the discomfort, somewhere to send it, some shape to pour it into. And that is why stopping can feel so much harder than people expect. Because if the person stops, they lose that temporary outlet. Now they have to sit with the full emotional weight of what happened. The money, the mistake, the fear, the unfinished feeling. But if they place another bet, they get a short suspension of all that. Not peace, suspension. And in a distressed mind, suspension can feel close enough to peace that the person grabs it anyway. That is why relief becomes part of the trap. The bet feels like medicine, even when it is feeding the wound. The action feels soothing, even when the result may hurt more. And little by little, the purpose of the game changes. This is the turning point people often miss. At the beginning, the person may truly be playing for pleasure, for excitement, for stimulation, for the fantasy of a win, for the rush. But eventually, there is a shift. Quiet at first, then unmistakable. Now the person is no longer playing because it feels good. They are playing because not playing feels worse. That is the turning point. And once that happens, the entire experience changes. Pleasure becomes secondary. Winning becomes symbolic. Relief becomes the real target. You can often hear it in the internal logic. Not, this is fun. Not, I want to enjoy this. Not even, I really think I can win. Instead, it becomes something more desperate. I just need one good hit. I just need to settle this. I just need to get back to even. I just need this feeling to stop. That is not the language of enjoyment. That is the language of regulation. The person is now using the game to manage their inner state, to reduce pressure, to avoid helplessness, to delay the emotional crash that might come if they stop. And that is why the behavior can continue long after the pleasure has faded, because pleasure is no longer the engine. Discomfort is. The game starts functioning less like entertainment and more like an emotional device, something the person leans on when their internal state becomes hard to bear. And that makes the whole thing much more dangerous, because people are usually more willing to walk away from something that stops being fun, but they are much less willing to walk away from something that feels like their last way to cope, even if that coping method is damaging them. Even if it keeps deepening the very state they are trying to escape. That is the true break. The moment the game stops being a source of excitement and starts becoming a tool for emotional survival. A false tool, a costly tool, a tool that keeps making the problem bigger. But in the moment, it does not feel false. It feels necessary. And once something starts feeling necessary, people stop treating it like a choice. They start treating it like something they have to do. That is when the grip becomes much tighter. Because now the person is not chasing fun. They are chasing relief. And relief is a far more powerful driver than pleasure, especially when the mind is under pressure. At that point, the game starts working like pain relief. Not real relief, not healing, just temporary numbing. Because when a person is overwhelmed by tension, regret, fear, and that unfinished feeling inside, the game offers something immediate. Not understanding, not recovery, not peace, just interruption. It interrupts the discomfort with movement. It interrupts the panic with action. It interrupts the emotional weight with one more moment of possibility. And that is why it can start to feel strangely comforting, even while it is doing damage. Not because the person enjoys suffering, because the mind will often reach for anything that changes the feeling fast enough. That is what makes this so deceptive. The game begins to function less like entertainment and more like a psychological anesthetic, a way to dull what is happening inside. For a moment, the person does not have to fully feel the loss. They do not have to sit with the fear. They do not have to face the fact that things may already be out of control. The game gives them a buffer, a brief emotional blur, a short window where discomfort gets pushed into the background by anticipation, urgency, and hope. That is why the cycle can feel almost soothing in the middle of so much distress. Because the person is no longer asking, "Is this good for me?" They are asking something much more immediate. Does this help me not feel what I am feeling right now? And in the short term, it often seems like the answer is yes. Not because the pain is gone, because the pain has been temporarily covered. That is how the trap gets deeper. The game becomes associated not only with excitement, but with escape. Not only with thrill, but with emotional sedation. And once something starts feeling like a sedative for your own mind, walking away from it becomes much harder than people expect. Because now, stopping does not just mean stopping the game. It means facing everything the game was helping you avoid. The loss, the fear, the shame, the helplessness, the silence after all the noise. That is why stopping can feel heavier than continuing. From the outside, continuing looks harder, more risk, more damage, more stress. But on the inside, stopping can feel like falling straight into the full emotional impact of everything that has happened. As long as the person keeps playing, they can still postpone that moment. They can stay in motion. They can stay in the loop. They can keep pretending there is still a way to fix this before they have to truly feel it. But the second they stop, the shield drops. Now there is no next spin to focus on, no next hand to wait for, no next outcome to hide behind. Now there is only reality. And reality can feel unbearable when someone has been using action to outrun emotion. That is why people often say they will stop after the next one, or after they get close to even, or after one good hit, or after they feel better. Because psychologically, the mind is trying to create a softer exit, a less painful landing, a moment where stopping will not feel so sharp. But that moment rarely arrives, because the person is waiting to stop from a place of relief, while the game keeps generating new reasons to stay distressed. So the exit keeps moving. It stays just out of reach. And that is why continuing can start to feel easier than stopping, even when continuing is clearly destructive. Because continuing allows the person to remain protected from the full weight of the moment for just a little longer. One more minute, one more round, one more chance not to feel everything at once. But that protection comes at a brutal cost. Because every new bet does not just fail to solve the discomfort, it usually deepens it. This is the core of the trap. The person uses the next bet to escape pressure, but the next bet adds more uncertainty. They use the next bet to escape fear, but the next bet creates more risk. They use the next bet to escape helplessness, but the next outcome can make them feel even more powerless. So the thing they run toward is also the thing making the running necessary. That is what makes it such a closed loop. The game hurts. The person wants relief. The game seems to offer relief. The relief is brief. Then the game hurts more. And now the person needs even more relief than before. That is how the cycle feeds itself. Not through one dramatic moment, but through repeated emotional reinforcement. Small hits of hope, small collapses of tension, small bursts of possibility, then more loss, more pressure, more need. And every time this happens, the brain learns the same lesson again. When the discomfort rises, go back to the game. Even if the game is the reason the discomfort keeps rising in the first place. That is why the logic becomes so hard to break. Because the immediate emotional pattern feels convincing. Pain, then action, then temporary relief. The mind loves short-term links like that. It locks onto them. It repeats them. It starts trusting them, even when the larger pattern is clearly destructive. So the person ends up trapped in a system where every attempt to escape the anxiety strengthens the anxiety's grip. The solution becomes fuel for the problem. And once that pattern is established, what keeps a person in the game is usually not what people assume. It is not just greed, not just recklessness, not just the fantasy of a huge win. Sometimes those things are there, but very often, what really keeps the person in the game is something far more human and far more painful. They stay because the game has become tied to emotional regulation. It has become the place they go when tension rises, when shame grows, when control feels lost, when stopping feels too emotionally expensive. The game is no longer just a source of stimulation. It becomes a place where the person tries to manage their own internal state, badly, costly, destructively. But still, that is the function it begins to serve, and that matters. Because once a behavior becomes connected to emotional survival, people do not evaluate it the same way anymore. They do not see it as just a bad habit. They do not see it as just a poor decision. They start feeling that they need it to get through the moment, even if a part of them knows it is harming them. That is why someone can hate what is happening and still return to it. Why they can feel disgust, fear, exhaustion, and still keep going. Because what is holding them there is not pleasure. It is dependency on the state change the game seems to provide, the promise of relief, the illusion of control, the suspension of pain, the hope that the next moment will undo the last one. Those are powerful forces, much more powerful than simple enjoyment. And once they take over, the game stops functioning like entertainment altogether. It starts functioning like a coping mechanism. A destructive one, but a coping mechanism all the same. And that leads to the real ending of this whole cycle. Gambling does not continue because it still feels good. That is the illusion. What keeps it going, especially in its darker phase, is the attempt to stop feeling bad. That is the shift people miss. From the outside, it may still look like excitement. There is still movement, still intensity, still urgency, still energy. But inside, the emotional logic has changed completely. The person is no longer chasing pleasure. They are trying to silence discomfort, trying to lower the pressure, trying to outrun the anxiety, trying to delay the crash that might come if they finally stop. And that is why the cycle can become so powerful. Because anxiety is not sitting outside the game. It is built into the engine. The game creates tension. Then it offers temporary escape from that tension. Then it creates more of it again. So the person keeps returning, not because they are still having fun, but because they have started depending on the brief moments of relief the game seems to offer. Relief that never lasts. Relief that always costs more. Relief that keeps pushing the real emotional reckoning further away. And that is the final truth. In this stage, gambling is no longer about enjoyment. It is no longer even mainly about winning. It becomes an attempt to self-medicate with uncertainty, an attempt to treat anxiety with the very thing that keeps producing it. And that is why it can feel so hard to walk away. Because the person is not only giving up the game, they are giving up the false medicine they have been using to get through the pain. Even though that medicine has been making the pain worse all along.